Hi there, it's Larold, and today I'm going to talk about some recent changes Blizzard made to Threat on the BFA Beta, and Threat as a tanking mechanic in general. Since the title of this video is a question, let me just start by answering it. No! The sky is just fine and so's tanking. Alright, let's dive in. A couple of days ago, Blizzard greatly reduced tank threat generation on the BFA Beta. Threat's a pretty simple mechanic, but it's mostly hidden within normal gameplay. Basically, when a DPS deals a point of damage, they generate a point of threat. When tanks deal a point of damage on live servers, they generate 10 points of threat. Artifacts have some weird interactions that increase that from anywhere up to 14 or 20 points per point of damage, but that's really not that important. On the BFA Beta, tanks now only generate 4 points of threat per point of damage. This is a drop-off of anywhere from 60 to 80% compared to Legion, and it's why some members of the community are running around panicking like their hair's on fire. But wait! There's GCD changes. By reducing the number of offensive cooldowns available to a lot of specs and putting them all onto the global cooldown, Blizzard has lessened burst DPS throughout the entire game. While this will affect tanks like Warrior and Pally who still have offensive cooldowns, it's a much larger blow to DPS specs than it is to tanks. The point in a fight where tanks have the biggest chance of losing threat to a DPS is at the very beginning, when DPS cooldowns are all active and stacked up. Now that everyone's DPS cooldowns are on the GCD, those burst windows are much less powerful, and tanks have much less chance of having threat ripped off of them. Now let's talk about how you actually lose threat. In order to pull off of someone who has threat without taunting, you need to reach 110% of their threat value if you're in melee range, or 130% when outside of melee range. If you taunt, then your threat value is set exactly equal to theirs, and your threat generation is increased by 500% for the 3 seconds it's active. This makes it so that using a taunt and a couple of abilities is virtually guaranteed to lock that enemy down. Let's go back to that 60 to 80% reduction number again. In Legion, on single target boss fights, top tier DPS deal about twice as much damage as comparably skilled tanks. Just to give some actual numbers, the average DPS for the top 200 tanks on Mythic Varimathras is about 1.5 million DPS, and the average DPS for the top 200 DPS spec players is about 3 million DPS. With tanks generating 4 times more threat per point of damage than DPS and BFA, DPS would need to deal 4 times more damage than tanks to match their threat. They would also need to deal at least another 10% more damage than that to pull threat in melee range, or 30% more outside of melee range. In Legion, damage dealers could easily deal 3 to 5 times more DPS than a tank on the pull, which would result in them pulling threat at the BFA values. With the changes to cooldowns in BFA, this just isn't possible. Now that covers single target, but how about AoE? During Legion, DPS really outperforms tanks during short burst windows in AoE, such as those that pop up in Antorus. In Mythic Plus, tanks are more competitive, but a good DPS who's giving it all they got can still blow an equally skilled tank out of the water when their cooldowns are active. In BFA, tank damage is a lot more competitive in AoE, and tanks are currently keeping up with or even outperforming DPS. This does vary from tank to tank and group to group, of course, but generally, tank AoE DPS on the beta is more competitive with main spec DPS than it is on live. While comparing individual spells isn't a great basis for comparison between spec DPS or overall power, it can indicate the kind of changes Blizzard's trying to accomplish. So here goes. On live, Fury Warrior's Whirlwind AP value is about 90% of Protection's AP value for Thunderclap. On the beta, it's about 45% of Thunderclap's value. So how do these changes feel? I've run about 10 dungeons or so since the changes were implemented, and for the most part, threat is the same. The only point at which I really noticed any difference is when a DPS ran ahead and helped out by engaging mobs ahead of us. Pulling off of already pulled mobs took another global or 2 compared to live. For classes that radiate AoE damage all the time like Monk, DK, and Druid, this still basically meant automatic threat, and absolutely nothing had changed at all. Pally was the only class where I really noticed any of the changes, and that's primarily just because I'm not that great at Pally, and their AoE threat toolkit is extremely basic. Warrior and DH both have great AoE damage tools, but they're on moderate cooldowns, so when DPS pulled extra mobs while Thunderclap or Sigil of Flames or Immolation Aura were on cooldown, it took me a few extra seconds to pick them up. But you know what? That's just like live too. So if nothing has changed and everything's no problem, why did Blizzard make this change? You could make an argument that they didn't like the idea of a tank being able to leave the room to have a sandwich, come back, and still have threat. I don't have a problem with that. If a tank can leave the room for a sandwich, come back and still be alive, that's more of a problem for me. Now I don't know this for certain, but I think there's a possibility Blizzard may remove Skittish as a Mythic Plus affix in BFA. I would be happy with that. While it does make kiting an impossibility, I just don't really enjoy the idea of kiting as a tank anyways. And the reductions to slow values in tank toolkits seem to indicate Blizzard doesn't like tanks kiting either. Aside from that, I largely view Skittish as a free affix. Sometimes a DPS will randomly pop all their cooldowns on a pull and grab threat, but those situations are pretty rare. Whether I'm DPSing or tanking, I'm always trying to do as much damage as I possibly can while staying alive. So for a mythic affix to incentivize doing max damage is just like, I was already doing that anyway. The most important thing to realize is that I don't think Blizzard is trying to make threat matter in BFA. The problem with threat, which Blizzard realized all the way back in Cataclysm, is that threat means one player controls the entire group's DPS. If the tank isn't good, or if their class isn't tuned correctly, or they're under-geared, it totally hamstrings the rest of the group. Tanks being able to deal some amount of respectable damage makes pressing their offensive buttons feel rewarding, and it means something, like you're a part of the team. It also opens up the opportunity for tanks to participate in their own survival, aka active mitigation, which is a lot deeper and more reactive gameplay avenue than simply being max threat man. Max threat can be performed by a simulation. Using active mitigation intelligently to survive a boss cannot. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about tanking on the beta, ask away. I will be covering future beta updates and putting together more tank-related videos soon. So stay tuned for more great BFA Beta content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye!